Sound check for audio recording 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah. Okay, welcome to those who have joined us online for this, the public session of our board today. Again, we have a mixture of people in the room who are socially distanced, and a number of our board members who are zooming into the meeting and are online, and we'll take their questions from there. Good afternoon to all, and you're very welcome to the Chief Constable. Thank you for your report that's been submitted to us this month. Before I hand over to the Chief, just want to mention a few matters since our October board meeting. The subject of budget is a regular focus of discussion, and it's welcome that the Finance Minister has confirmed the 5.6 million of funding for PSNI to cover EU costs in the October monitoring round. Of course, the issue remains of having a sustained funding commitment, particularly in respect of any additionality associated with the EU exit. You were giving oral evidence to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee yesterday, Chief Constable, and I've written to the committee chair to support your position around resourcing, but there are still clearly some funding issues that need to be ironed out. In your report, you have provided a detailed update on issues around the policing and issues of policing and issuing of notices for COVID, and I thank you for that report and for the detail confirmed within it. It's very useful background. It's useful to actually stop and take particular note of all that's been going on over the last while. Debate focused this week around the use of marshals and others on enforcement, so it would be helpful for current thoughts on the use of designated others to be brought forward. Also, a lot of effort has been invested to minimise the operational impact of COVID-19 in terms of PSNI officers and staff available for work. So perhaps you could touch on the numbers around that. And again, I know there have been, whether they were leaked or otherwise, but numbers in the press this week. Yesterday, you will be aware, marked the 19th anniversary of the establishment of the PSNI and indeed of the Northern Ireland Policing Board. Real progress has been made in that time, but there are new demands and challenges facing the service, and we've been working with you on transformational plans for the next 5 years. Next week, we will be moving forward with the advertisement for the new Chief Operating Officer position. This role, we believe, is pivotal for the service, and working directly to you, Chief Constable, helps responsibility for driving forward strategic change, business modernisation, and bringing focus to value for money in the use of resources across the PSNI. We're also moving forward with the recruitment of the final 3 positions to the new leadership team structure: the Director of People and Organisational Development, Director of Transformation, and Director of Corporate Services, and those will all progress in the very near future. Your report references current crime figures. I'd just like to mention the issue of scams. Next week marks the 4th anniversary of the ScamWise partnership, which is chaired by Chief Superintendent Walls, bringing together groups from all sectors. It has been doing some fabulous work in awareness raising and helping people protect themselves from becoming scamming victims. Over £8 million was lost to scammers in Northern Ireland over the last 2 years, and we know it is a crime that remains vastly underreported and often targets the vulnerable. Can I just record thanks to the partnership for their work and to remind us all of their message: if you can spot scam, you can stop a scam. So, with those introductory remarks, we move forward to your comments around your report, and then we will take questions from members. Chief Constable.
Thank you very much, Chair. Obviously, just a few things to say by way of introduction over and above the report, where we have, through the offices of John, who's sat somewhere beside me or behind me, is try to put a lot of detail into the report to reflect some of the health environment as much as the policing response, and some of the work that Alan has been doing so much on, both in terms of the enforcement space and also keeping our own organisation as safe as we can. I'll touch on designated others in a moment. I think just by beginning in terms of reflecting your own introductions, firstly, thank you to the board for that continuing support in terms of helping us reshape the top team. It's only just one element of the ambition we've got in terms of making us more progressive as an organisation. And of course, it is timely, as you did, Chair, to mark the notable passing of now the 19th birthday, as it were, of the police service here. But we do continue to want to build on the efforts and hard-won gains, frankly, of our predecessors to make the organisation more visible, accessible and responsive, because I know that's important to everybody. Clearly as well, it's timely to note the work of Scamwise, and also thank you for singling out Simon, who was actually recognised recently in the Queen's Honours for his work, notably in that space that seemed just recognition. And I know it's something that he takes very much to heart. In terms of wider themes, just diverting a bit from the report at the moment, but trying to capture those other things in the margins that I know will often attract interest. A few bits just to mention before we take questions. Firstly, last weekend saw some media commentary in relation to decisions around the new operational uniform. And I think it's worth stating that the main thrust of this is to make sure that, from my point of view as the employer, that the people we ask to do frontline work have decent and fit for work and modern practical workwear. And that's the underpinning sort of notion around this. It's not just change for change's sake. The pilot has started. The feedback from frontline colleagues is really positive, but clearly, ultimately, any major decisions around cost and utility will be something we need to both assess ourselves and then come back to here. You did touch upon yourself, Chair, and thank you. It's been a busy week in terms of a few sort of other competing pressures alongside the board. Yesterday, I was able to join Steve Rodhouse and a colleague from HMRC to give our perspective to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. A couple of takeaways, I suppose, and everyone will come to their own conclusions from a long session, but about giving assurance, I think, that we're not here to politicise whatever happens with Brexit. But whilst I think I said last time, some of this may be seen, certainly in terms of the management of data, of something akin from moving from Wi-Fi to modem, we have to be adaptive and agile. The border is porous at the moment. Things aren't perfect, but we need to work closely either with the UK government or bilaterally with other countries in the next few weeks if there are serious pressures around what Brexit means for the safety of this country. It was a good opportunity, actually. You signalled about future plans, but to mention the idea of the crime campus, which may have some questions later, but effectively it's to use experience from elsewhere to build our own sort of multi-agency crime fighting centre as part of the headquarters renewal programme, if we're able to get support for that over the years ahead. Clearly, COVID has been the focus of the report to you today, and we continue to work with the Executive Office and civil service partners, and Alan particularly, I'm sure we'll touch on later, his role both as our operational goal commander, but the contact with the enforcement group. And I think, frankly, using that opportunity to touch on the designated others question, that's an approach that we welcome. Clearly, there's a role for the rule of law and policing in this space, but actually there are other partners that can play their part too to divert work away from us and still join that endeavour to keep all of us safe in this COVID environment. You'll see from the report itself that one of our dilemmas at the moment, frankly, is that largely both calls for service, antisocial behaviour and crime are creeping back to the levels we would expect to see before COVID. So effectively, we're at business as usual, plus the pressures of policing the COVID environment, and we may touch upon that a little bit later. I think it's also worthy of mention about operational resilience. We track that closely. The figures are something we released through Alan, actually, as part of the weekly sort of commentary on enforcement and resilience. So I think part of it is that it's to assure yourself that we maintain operational resilience. There's the need for flexibility sometimes in different parts of the country, either through the effects of the virus itself or contact trace, but it's something that Alan and the team monitor on a daily basis to make sure we continue to provide service to the public, but we can probably touch upon that later. There has been some commentary as well this week about the printing of fixed penalty notices to support new regulations, and we can give more detail on that later, but suffice to say, it's actually quite a complex process that involves system change, both to us, the courts and the Public Prosecution Service, as well as physically printing the new booklet. So there is a reason for that. I think drawing away from COVID, a couple of quick points actually. Firstly, you'll see on our social media platform some information going out alongside the board today to say just what we've achieved this month in the fight against serious and organised crime, and some impressive seizures around both the recovery of cannabis and cocaine, multi-million pounds of both seized off our streets as a result of developing our own intelligence, and particularly the ongoing support with the National Crime Agency. Maybe a theme we'll come back to next month when the director joins us. Finally, just before I do stop for questions, I'll mention two particular items of interest, just because I know it is a matter of public interest at the moment. Firstly, our investigations in relation to the alleged breaches of the COVID regulations that were pursuant to the Bobby Storey funeral in the summer continue. Mark Webster is still actively leading that investigation on our behalf, and as soon as we have a clear conclusion, we will be able to update the board further, but I can't really say much more meaningful than that at the moment. Similarly, I think it's important to stress there's been a lot of interest in the last few days about the alleged crime that may go alongside the payment of COVID grants. And that, again, has attracted a lot of interest. I think it's a matter of fact that a political representative did personally report this matter to me last Friday. We assessed what was said there, and as would be the course in terms of our crime recording rules, recorded a crime, but we have not yet begun an investigation because effectively we're awaiting a determination from the Department of Economy, who are factually the complainant, as to whether they see that the standards has been met, that there has been criminal behaviour as opposed to any other form of issue. So again, as soon as we have clarity on that point from them, even if it's out with the timetable of the board, I can let you know, Chair. But I think that's enough for now, because it's about using the time for questions.
Okay, thank you, Chief Constable. I'm going to start with COVID, which was the main part of your report, and Dolores is going to lead the questions on that. Dolores.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks, Chief, for your report. Can I just go back a wee bit then in relation to the idea that was reported last week in the media around marshals, and you referenced the executive enforcement group. Can you give us any further detail around the discussions on that, and whether or not there has been any meeting with representatives of the retail sector, particularly the large retail providers? We know that they can already refuse to serve people who they believe to be underage with cigarettes or alcohol. And I had a very distressing message this morning from a constituent whose wife's a nurse and having to wear the PPE gear all the time, and the discomfort that brings about. And yet when they come home from work, they witness huge numbers of people going in and out of the shops without wearing any masks at all, and it's causing a great deal of distress. And then maybe you could tell us a wee bit about the fixed penalty notices. You said it was something that was, the process was very drawn out in terms of the different partners, and whether or not that has been resolved. And I just wonder, in relation then to the bit and spike, or the bit and spit guards, how effective and they have been, and in the light of new evidence, and whether or not there have been many incidents of them having been used. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Probably what I'll do is split that into two halves, frankly, because I know it would be a shame not to let Alan comment on the detailed work he's been doing with the retail sector and also in the enforcement group. So I'll do that in a sec. In relation to spit and bite guards, I think we review this every few weeks formally. In terms of the effectiveness, every time a spit and bite guard is used, part of our operating procedure is to offer this up to the police ombudsman, where they view the body-worn video footage. That has happened on every occasion, I think, except one now from memory, where there wasn't kit available. And so far, she has not, or her staff have seen anything that would cause concern in terms of the attitude or indeed the use of force in the application of this particular piece of equipment. So it is something that we do take really seriously, both in terms of my needs as the sort of the employer under the Health and Safety Act to protect officers in this environment, because frankly, spitting or biting is reprehensible. I personally watched some footage from last week, which was really quite distressing, seeing what officers had to put up with firsthand when someone was spitting in their face and biting them. So we have to recognise that whilst balancing against other human rights concerns. So we do moderate that when I conduct those reviews. And as you're aware, through previous reports to the board, we're trying to address this on a twin track approach. firstly, the longer term sort of consultation, which John Roberts is doing to support an equality impact assessment, as well as operating this particular piece of equipment in the COVID environment. So that continues under John's leadership. If there's a change to policy or practice, obviously we do keep it under review, and we will be able to report that to the chair and to the board if we get to that point in future. Clearly, it's upsetting to hear what you've described there, Dolores, from the experiences of someone that clearly is doing so much as a nurse on the front line to protect us all from COVID. And clearly, there is a raft of opportunities for us to change behaviour, but also sometimes to ask other people to do their bit too. So at that point, I'll probably hand to Alan to just describe some of that work we're doing at the moment through the various forms that he's involved in to try and give you that sense of reassurance.
Thanks, Chief. Thanks, Dolores. So, Dolores, there is a strategic enforcement group chaired by the junior ministers and with a range of partners involved in those conversations have been for some weeks now. Clearly, as a police service, since the early days of the first regulations, we've been promoting the concept of as many designated bodies as possible, so that you have significant coverage across all areas in assistance with the regulations and their compliance or enforcement. And that has been the journey over time. The marshals piece comes out of plans that are being evolved, and not by policing, but by the wider executive group, around the concept of safer businesses and safer town centres. And you'll have seen media coverage around hand sanitising stations in streets, the marshals arrangements supported by local authority arrangements, supported by policing arrangements. So we're trying to build a layered approach, which gives us an approach that gives a safe public spaces in the COVID environment, really an extension of the work that was done in workplaces, for instance. So we're supportive of that approach, and we're supportive of the strands evolving from it. But decisions around designation and funding will ultimately be one for the executive, and we're keen to support those measures going forward. There's also been structural changes around support group underneath the enforcement group to make sure that there's a local connectivity with that strategic intent. So where those things are developed by the executive in terms of policy, we're putting arrangements in operationally with our partners to make sure that that's delivered on the ground. So that sort of touches on the marshals piece. The retailers meetings, since really March, I've been having pretty much, other than a bit of a lull in the summer when things were a little bit quieter, we've been having regular meetings. I've sort of fortnightly dial in with representatives from manufacturing, from large retailers, from small retailers, and all the various representatives groups. And by happy coincidence, the most recent of those was yesterday. I also know those representatives have met junior ministers and other members within the executive enforcement group. And that's an open dialogue where we listen to their concerns, looking at how we plan the way forward, but also how we address their day-to-day concerns at a local level through local commanders. And thirdly, the piece you touched on around fixed penalty notices. There was a strategic intention announced by the Minister in the Assembly. Once it happens to that point, it goes to the people who draft the actual legislation. It wasn't just a simple case of taking the previous tickets and their structure and changing the fine levy level, because there were the introduction of new offences under new regulations. That had to be drafted by the drafts people in the executive office, the relevant executive offices and departments. That had to be then confirmed, put forward as draft legislation. The court service then have to code that, PPS have to be cited, and that all happens behind the scenes. The police service involvement in this has largely been one of picking up the product of that process and using our procurement route to get them printed as quickly as possible. And that's what we've done to support that overall effort. But it is a pretty lengthy process end to end, and wasn't simply changing the format of the old ticket, which explains why these things take time. They are a triplicate book. They are coded for court service and PPS use, and they are a very bespoke piece of business, which has a significant lead-in time, and some of that's just outside of our control.
Trevor, could just come back briefly. The experience of working alongside local councils, can you give us a sense of how that's operating, if at all? And the other bit was, I've been led to believe that there's greater enforcement, or at least their compliance in the south, where there may be a different approach taken. I just wonder, have you had any exchanges on an all-Ireland basis in terms of how some of these regulations might be better enforced?
There has been a good engagement and good working with local councils and local authorities since this started. That's formalised through the enforcement group, where a solace representative is a senior representative of local councils on that grouping, and we work very closely with those. Wendy Middleton, that you will know, Dolores, who was previously in your area up until recently, is now the COVID Silver Commander, is joined in through the commanders and out into chief executives within every local council, so that where we make those decisions centrally with the enforcement group. A really good example, I suppose, was last weekend, which was a Halloween weekend, and there was a lot of work done by local councils about the potential for antisocial behaviour on council premises or council property across Northern Ireland. And the plan was that councils would deliver that, policing would support it, and that together we would make a difference. And I think for a Halloween weekend, I think we had a pretty good success out of that. So I think that's a pretty good example of how, and so it works structurally at a senior level, but right down to individual district commander and district council level, which I think is clearly where the work gets done and clearly where the success is delivered from. In terms of working with the South, again, it was just one of those days yesterday. So I was talking to the Assistant Commissioner for the Border Region, Barry O'Brien, yesterday. That's a regular conversation that Brian and I would have to compare notes, to compare what's working and what's not. I think it would be fair to say the challenges we face are absolutely mirrored by our colleagues on Garda Traffic. And I don't get any sense from that feedback, either operationally on the ground or through my conversations with the Assistant Commissioner, that the compliance rates are particularly different in either side of the border. I think we face the same problems for the same reasons, and we continue to work together to see how we can improve that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Meryvn, you have a question around crime figures, I believe.
Yes, thanks, Chair, and welcome to Chief Constable and his colleagues. Welcome the confirmation from him, in particular in relation to ongoing investigations in relation to Meryvn Storey funeral, and also the issues in regards to the constituency officers. Chief Constable, you will be well aware that history and anniversaries are never too far away from us in Northern Ireland, and this week we remembered the 100th anniversary of the establishment of special constables in 1920, and today, sadly, my own constituency, we have the 37th anniversary of the murder of Reserve Constable Johnny McFadden, who was gunned down outside his own home in the village of Rishardon. And obviously, there's a reminder to us all of the challenges that we have in dealing with policing, particularly in regards to the past, and also the challenges that we have in the future. That brings me to the figures that you gave in your report, where you said you indicated that despite there was a 14.5% reduction in recorded crime, it would seem that we have an increase in antisocial behaviour and domestic crime. And I'm wondering, is there not more to do with a coding and a recording issue, or is it a reflection of some of the challenges that we're facing in communities who are trying to deal and not deal too well with this issue of lockdown and some people taking advantage of that?
Thanks, Meryvn. Obviously, in a few comments you make there, there is obviously this weekend it marks remembrance, and we'll be holding our own service on the 11th. So there is obviously that enduring opportunity to recognise the past and the sacrifice of others in all sorts of different ways. Interestingly, I'd probably draw your attention in the report, Meryvn, to pages 4, 5 and 6, because it is quite helpful, particularly when you look at the antisocial behaviour, that effectively it has followed quite literally closely either changes in regulation or some key events, particularly across the summer. So you'll see notable spikes, which then have, if you like, fueled the figures. Antisocial behaviour, if you go on a full year basis, and I think the stats were issued actually last week, that it is slightly more up than our own report says, because it's just time frames and where you pick the data points from. So antisocial behaviour for the year is now up 20%, but that is largely drawn from the different reporting that we're now doing to codify antisocial behaviour that we can attribute to COVID. So it might be large breaches, for example, on a beach, through to other issues more locally in communities. I don't think it's actually fair to try and describe those changes as solely about one particular part of the community or the other. We police the whole of the country, and there are a variety of causes around antisocial behaviour, which is largely dealt with either through resolution at the contact centre the online reporting tool or indeed response from the officers that pretty much Alan leads. Crime has fallen. We're now down just 6% nearly down, which in one sense is good news, but factually it actually is more of the fact that crime is catching up in terms of where we would expect to be for this time of year. And again, you'll see that from the trajectory on the graphs that's in the report, Meryvn. There is always, particularly in relation to crime, some of the changes over the last few years, we would say, are partly because of police enforcement, and we've reported that a number of times to the board, even in my time, about particularly more drug offences pushing figures up, and equally because it's quite a complex part of the vulnerability environment, better recording of harassment-related offences in the space of domestic abuse. That said, through the work that Mark and I are particularly doing in terms of refresh of our performance framework, we are putting more scrutiny at the moment on the recording of crime, and may well come back to report that in future to a committee and indeed to the board.
Thank you, and can I just thank the Chief as well for getting on the train and coming to Ballymoney. Unfortunately, I wasn't able because I have been locked away as a result of being pinged by the COVID app, and then my young boy, the youngest son, being tested positive for COVID. So for the last 3 weeks now, nearly, I have been. It's not a bad thing. I've been locked away, and maybe that would be a great help to society. But thank you for taking the time to come, even though you weren't able to be welcome to the kingdom.
I wasn't going to comment on all those positive letters I had about how quiet things were over the last while, Meryvn, but we know the detailed reason now, and you don't need to thank the Chief about getting on the train. He just loves to get on trains. However, thank you for that. And Tom, you have a question.
Well, I think that this has been covered in your opening remarks, and Meryvn did make mention to it, Chief, with regards to the constituency officers and the issues that happened there, and they come to the fore last week, obviously. And you have said, obviously, it's recorded as a crime, and it is now for the department to bring forward information if this is to be investigated. Can I just ask for clarity then, have you folk contacted the department in relation to this matter and requested the information from them?
Yeah, yes, we have. What we've got at the moment, because clearly this is a serious issue of public concern. So in sort of police speak, we've established a goal group. So in other words, a high level oversight of the response to this, which Barbara Gray, who's not here today, is personally leading. And a senior officer that reports to her has contacted the Department for Economy to seek clarification of do they wish to see this as a complaint of crime or deal with this by other means. And we're awaiting that response. But there's active dialogue between the two of us at the moment.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Michael, you have a question around human trafficking.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Chief Constable and your colleagues. The Criminal Justice Inspectorate published a report on how the criminal justice system deals with modern slavery and trafficking. That report was published on the 15th of October. The report highlights a number of positives, including good links between the NCA and PSNI, and also excellent working relationships between the PPS and the PSNI Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking Unit. However, it does highlight areas for attention, including the availability of a full range of enforcement powers in Northern Ireland, the extent to which the PSNI strategic assessment was fully informed regarding tackling offences against children in particular, the importance of frontline officers being able to interpret modern slavery as child abuse, and ensuring effective training, and recommending that the PSNI examines the reasons for the differential in national referral rates between NI and other UK police forces within the next 6 months. I think that the Belfast Telegraph actually reported that Detective Inspector Mark Bell's comments on the 17th of October on Anti-Slavery Day on the steps been taken by the PSNI to identify and raise awareness of modern slavery and human trafficking. So the question really is, if you could maybe outline your own views, your own reaction to the report, and whatever plans you may have to follow up on the recommendations.
Well, like many things, we're always here to learn and improve, because just to stand on your laurels on any range of things, you need that third party challenge and insight to get better. We did receive the report. I think there were 6 recommendations for us. We've now brought them into it sounds a bit formulaic, but a governance process led by Barbara Gray to make sure that we address the issues that the inspector had raised. And then there's another process that Mark chairs to make sure that we do what it says on the tin, and in due course we'll report back to the inspectorate herself. Suffice to say, it is a matter of concern. It's a serious issue, not just for the police service here, but for the whole of policing, particularly across Europe at the moment. It's something we're acutely aware of, that I touched upon earlier about any changes to the environment we're working that's post EU exit, and we are closely working with the National Crime Agency in particular, and colleagues in the Guards, to make sure that, I think my comments yesterday, frankly, were that the border north-south don't become the soft underbelly of the common travel area. So there's always the risk of exploitation of gaps by organised crime groups, and certainly the evidence would show about the flow of people who are trafficked here for various reasons from Europe into the south and then up into Belfast, either to stay here or into the rest of the UK. So it's something that we want to keep focused on, and actually it's one of the reasons I touched upon before, that this won't be overnight, but the crime centre, the crime campus, whatever you want to end up calling it, gives you that sort of fusion approach to share data more real time and keep one step ahead of some of these problems, because it isn't going to go away, frankly.
Thank you. Trevor, you had a question? Yes, unrelated, yeah.
I suppose a couple of different, in the previous session there was talk about the new legislation coming forward with licensing, and it would maybe, now that we're in public session, I mean, that was a response thing to Tom, your concerns around that, and given that we're all very aware that you're under-resourced in terms of the numbers and the commitment from the executive fund to the NDNA of 7,500, do you think that will have an additional impact on the service in terms of how you can deliver going forward?
Well, certainly, I think there's a couple of bits, thanks to licensing, and even, as we talked previously. Firstly, you can anticipate, without gainsaying where the Assembly chooses to go, but clearly extending licensing hours and therefore the hospitality offer, if you see it in those terms, you would have to recognise may well be a plank of economic restart after whatever COVID finally ends up like, be it for just the economy here or attracting tourism back. And obviously our duty, frankly, as a police service, is to respect the will of the Assembly and enforce whatever changes and laws that may or may not flow from that. I think you make a really good point, though, because obviously through particularly, again, the work that Alan would pick up, that the changes to the operational day will have consequences about where we put our people. And sometimes if it's like an elastic band and you're sort of pulled at both ends, so you may imagine a world of dealing with disorder and crime at 5 in the morning as a consequence of excessive drinking throughout the evening, as well as dealing with antisocial behaviour early in the evening, you will end up pulling that elastic band too much. So clearly, it's well rehearsed, and thank you for raising it, Trevor. That we and indeed you have said that to meet the challenges of policing this country, we would assert that we need 7,500 officers, which is roughly 500 more than we've got at the moment. And if the environment which we operate changes again, we would hope that that commitment is met so that we can keep policing those new challenges and keep communities safe.
And can I thank you for that, Chief Constable? And I mean, personally, I have no view on the legislation. I'm just purely from a police perspective, I'm actually interested in what your view was, and that was useful. On a separate one, and I suppose given that it's topical now with the COVID, and I remember in this room where you outlined a very stark picture of what it could look for the service, and think that it looks like we didn't get to that stage. But we are too aware that some officers have been affected, and I mean, that was inevitable, that was going to happen. But what's the current picture in terms of the service, in terms of your officers who are either isolating or have, unfortunately, have had COVID and are off for that reason?
Alan might have or at least yesterday's picture, because we do monitor it through the work that Alan leads every day. But just try and give you some general sense that we now run a coordination centre around the clock. And we use that to look at operational resilience. We use it to look at advice around contact tracing, because you'll see inevitably we get officers now come into contact in the community with either victims, witnesses, or indeed offenders that either have COVID or certainly might have symptoms. So that would trigger an immediate response. And actually, on a side issue, they're also here to give advice about enforcement. So we try and ensure as much as we can there's consistency right across the country when dealing with similar issues. We track this, as you're right in saying that some of the scenarios, you go back to March, it's hard to remember what it felt like, but it was pretty awesome, the initial modelling that we'd done on health advice, which is one of the reasons we collapsed to 12-hour shifts, both to help support the vehicle checkpoints, which were needed to minimise travel, as well as anticipate some of the effects on the organisation. Fortunately, that hasn't manifest, but frankly, because I think it's fair to say that on this occasion now, the disease is something that is borne by community transmission rather than perhaps numbers of people falling ill, sadly, in care homes. Just like the community, we saw particular spikes early in the month where we would get numbers of officers either ill or having to self-isolate because of largely our own contact trace arrangements. But I don't know if you've got the latest breaking news for this week, Ollie.
Thanks, Chief, and thanks, Trevor. So the predictions and the projections for planning early in the year with organisations the size of the police could experience up to 35% absence rate, which would take us to 65% of our capacity, which is obviously really stark warning. And as you appreciate, thankfully we haven't got there. The lowest we've been at is 84.2% in terms of police officer numbers. That occurred about 10 days or a fortnight ago, and that's indicative of the high rates of community transmission that we've seen in the second wave. We're an organisation of 10,000 people, so we suffer the same stresses and strains as any other large organisation. And actually, there are far more contacts and infections come through contact with our workforce outside the workplace than they do within what is a COVID-safe environment. We've had, from the very start of this, we have had, just checking my numbers, make sure I get it right in terms of it. Lost the line. As of yesterday, we're up to 86.6 again, so we have seen that corner turn, and I suppose that also reflects the community transmission rate changing and the R number falling, as has been reported by the health advisors to government. So it has been the other impact for us, and I suppose the bigger impact this time around is that we have a really strict contact and trace system within the service, because that's one of our key ways of protecting our workforce, where we identify those people who have been in contact, that we look at those case by case, item by item, circumstance by circumstance to make informed decisions around that, because clearly we're keen to not allow that then to get wider inside the organisation. And that has been some difficult choices because of the nature of the illness. People can be asymptomatic and you don't find out until they've been in contact with large numbers of people. And we have had a significant number of circumstances in the workplace where we have been tested when we found people have been positive, but thankfully, in the vast majority of those, our safe working practices have meant that we haven't had to isolate really substantial numbers out of those, but it was always a risk. And equally, we've had some circumstances in the workplace where that hasn't been the case, and we have had to isolate large numbers of people. But I'm absolutely committed to where we identify those close contacts, and if they have to be self-isolated, then they have to be self-isolated. But when you talk about, going into the winter, sitting at 85%, it is a stress on the system. It is costing a significant amount of finance to make sure that we fulfill our promises around both neighbourhood policing and indeed general service delivery right across the organisation, not just in uniform, but in serious crime investigation, ops support. And the Deputy, through his control of COVID funding, has had to put significant amounts of money back into district policing budget to allow us to continue to deliver those promises. But that was a commitment the Chief gave, and we're delivering on his behalf.
And I suppose finally, there has been much talk about, in terms of the contact tracing, not directly with yourselves, but in terms of the government themselves. We're hearing obviously anecdotal evidence about the length of time it takes to A, get a test, and B, get a result. We're also hearing from the mainland that they're turning around some of this stuff within 15 minutes. Is there anything in particular for your service in terms of your officer, given that they are an essential part of what we need on the ground at the minute, that they get these done in a more efficient manner than everyone else? And I mean, also just when I'm speaking, I'd like to commend for the resilience that you actually have built into the system at the start of this. I mean, it was a scary picture for us all, indeed it was for you, but I think that has been borne out in how you have handled that as you've faced the problems. But I think the track and trace, that it's interesting to get people back. And then the other thing that's been muted actually in the back of that was where they're talking about reducing the period of time from 14 days down to 7 or 10. Is that something you're looking at the minute, or maybe just if you give us the current position on that?
So Trevor, yes, and just the number I was looking for earlier, since it started in March, we've had 169 individuals in the organisation who have been absent, confirmed COVID sick. So that 169 out of an organisation of 10,000 gives you some of the scale around that, and that has been since the very start of this in February, March. Originally, we had and still have actually a fast track through the Public Health Agency for testing for our members. Now, actually, the public health availability at the moment to the general public, the performance of that has improved to an extent where they're almost equally effective, and for that reason, we find that some of our officers and staff use the public available test without going through a specific PSNI one, because they are very comparable in terms of their turnaround time. The 15-minute result is new technology, very, very, very new and very recently available, which I don't think is commonly available here at this point in time. But clearly, as that becomes available, we'll do what we did before: work with the Public Health Agency and look at the best way we can leverage that to make sure that we get the best service for our officers and therefore maintain our capability.
Thank you. Just before we move off this subject, in terms of resilience, and it is very positive, and I echo the comments that Trevor made around the contingencies that you've had in place to deal with all of this. It is very impressive. But with regard to resilience, the big issue in society now seems to be the mental health impacts of lockdown after lockdown and indeed what's coming through with COVID. How much have you dealt with internally in terms of supporting your own officers and staff and from a mental health perspective?
Actually, quite a lot. One of the novel things we did, actually, we ran a survey in the middle of this period now, rather than seeing it as two ends. And that was with a company who had experience about sort of behavioural insight type stuff. And what that actually showed was Alan is famous for his almost daily bulletins about what to do, and both in terms of personal responsibilities, frankly, sometimes, as well as legislation change. And what that did show, actually, quite interestingly, was different attitudes in different age bands to feelings of anxiety, of illness, as well as how the messaging that we were giving out worked for them in terms of that general wraparound. So that was something that we've been able to start to work with now with the Director of HR to sort of try and make sure that communication fits everyone's need. So it's quite interesting. Similarly, we ran some other work which has shown some of the broader mental health impacts on the organisation, which are quite serious. We haven't formally considered that yet as a board. I think it's next week, Mark, isn't it? Which Mark will probably want to touch on in a minute. And clearly as well, despite the COVID restrictions, we've been operating the Occupational Health and Welfare Service, which I actually went personally to see about 10 days ago. And again, it's through a lot of Alan's work that we're able to either spot issues quickly or offer support. But clearly, individual people, we're just part of society, and you can imagine scenarios. Either you've got the immediate worry that we touched upon it before with Dolores's question, but you're spat in the face by someone that says they have COVID. There's that anxiety that what am I going to get transmitted to me and my family, right through to people that might have a partner that's furloughed or their business is folding. There's a whole range of pressures over and above the day-to-day tempo of policing here. But I don't know what Mark wants to say more about that report we're looking at next week.
I suppose just first of all, Alan can confirm this, but we have, I mean, our occupational health department would say we have had an increase in sort of anxiety related referrals during the COVID period. So we've seen that increase, and therefore there's a demand there. But we've just received a piece of work that we've considered one governance board, and we're hopefully talking about it again next week. But this piece of evidence would suggest that our police officers are suffering higher levels of mental health issues than comparable police services around the UK, and also comparable to the general population in Northern Ireland. The sense of PTSD, anxiety, and other related issues are higher in our organisation. So this is just a new piece of research that we've got, and we're just considering as a team how we can take it forward. I mean, and I know the board have talked to us a number of occasions about our capacity issues and so forth, which have increased over the years, but which have also which are difficult because it's a very difficult area to recruit into in terms of mental health professionals into our organisation. But probably something the board will want to come back to us, chair on in the future. So we're hoping to talk about this as a team next week. But there are very concerning issues, I think, for the service, none of which are entirely new to us, but it does, I think, show the depth of pressure the police officers in Northern Ireland serve under compared probably to most other jurisdictions.
It would, yeah, we certainly would like to hear the outcome from all of that, and it's a worrying information, as you say. Did you say, Mark, that it's reflective of Northern Ireland society as well, those higher levels?
Yeah, so just cast my mind back to the charts, the comparators done against other UK police services and also then against the general population, and we were tracking higher against both. So yeah.
So high, the police service were higher than the general population.
For certain types of mental health issues. Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, an area we certainly would like to support you in where we can and to hear more about. Thank you for that. Frank had asked a question in private session, which I'd like him to cover off in public, given the interest that's there around uniforms. So, Frank, if you could ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Constable. It was regarding the whole uniforms, the trial of the new uniforms, and it was reported in the press during the week of the weekend, actually, about costs associated with the trial and projected costs for the implementation across the whole force. They just didn't seem to marry up these costs. And also to ask a couple of supplementary questions on that. Are you getting any feedback yet from the users and from the public? And I know one of my colleagues on the board had asked previously about the public consultation timelines. Long question on one subject.
I'll try and give a brief answer, but who knows? But thank you for raising it, because it is a really important point, because I know from the workforce's point of view, this has been something that for a good while now, if you speak to frontline colleagues, to the Police Federation, they've been really keen that, we touched upon the 19th birthday of the police service in the introductory remarks, but frankly, the uniform hasn't changed since, but the world around us has, and what would be seen as effective, if you like, utility workwear, which I think is the sort of posh phrase, has changed dramatically in many other parts, not just of the UK, but right across Europe. It's a 3-month trial. We are trialing 4 different types of top and 2 different types of trousers for various reasons, and it's been issued to 6 sites. I think it's fair to say it was disappointing, some of the media coverage the other day. I'm acutely aware about being a guardian and custodian of precious public money. But it wasn't particularly helpful the way that article was reported, and we did challenge that with the publication concerned, because it could have misled people about both our motives and indeed the cost. It's a 3-month pilot. We will be doing that for a number of reasons. Firstly, as you say, to test officer feedback. Certainly, anecdotally, so far that has all been pretty positive, actually, in terms of its comfort, how it's surviving Machine Wash 40, if I can describe it as that, when we use it, because in all seriousness, one of the purposes of the pilot is to make sure that the quality maintains contact with day-to-day life, and that if we are to invest funds in it, that we're going to get value for money. The public side, we're going to address in 2 particular ways. Because that in itself, if we're not careful, will drive other costs, which may attract criticism. So we're going out through the PCSPs to use them as a vehicle to see how we have a conversation with the public about attitudes and feedback, and also through some social media surveys, which we'll be launching soon to again get that sort of snapshot pulse opinion. In terms of the total cost, we'll clearly come back to the board in due course. Firstly, when we're clear on what the pilot tells us. And then secondly, we already have a budget for overtime, which we would spend at the moment on equipping everybody with the same sort of workwear that you'll see Alan, Mark and I are wearing at the moment. So eventually this will be a trade-off between if we alter how we issue frontline officers with kit, we are likely to be able to make the cost of the whole thing relatively cost neutral if we make other choices about what we don't issue to the rest of the workforce. So the article led people to believe that 7,000 officers were going to get the new uniform in one go, and that wouldn't be the case. There may be different issues to different roles, but there'll all be things we'll consider once the pilot has been completed, and then when we're clear on that, we can report that back to yourselves.
Okay, thank you. Just checking, we're coming to the end of our session. I've covered up the questions that I noted as being down there. I'm just looking online and indeed within the room, make sure there is no one who hasn't been able to ask a question. No, okay. Can I just throw one final thing in? It's an aside to some degree, but we've seen just this week in England and Wales the introduction of the Army in delivering testing. And bringing their regime to bear, if you like, to try and make it rather more efficient and effective, particularly with the testing being rolled out right across Merseyside and Liverpool region. Are there, and I know I remember asking this question, I think way back at the start of COVID with regard to Army and the if you like, the rules of engagement, if they were brought in any way now, presumably if they were introduced from a health perspective, that doesn't impinge on what you do anyway. But are you aware of any moves similarly here to what we've seen in GB?
I'm not personally chair, but no, Alan's been party to any other conversation.
This cropped up previously, Chair, some months ago. I think the question was asked of the Minister of Health. The position on it is no, I'm not aware of any. And if there were to be such considerations, given that this is a health pandemic emergency, then any provision to support health is made by the health department to the respective agency, as they do, frankly, and I've said this in the police enforcement space. The work that we do in enforcement around the health regs currently is in response to a health ask from the executive, and any decision about any agency being used to support that effort would have to come from the Minister of Health through the devolved assembly and through that route.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for attending today and for answering the questions that we have put to you. Our next meeting, in terms of those who are joining us online, will be Thursday, the 3rd of December, and the Chief Constable and his team will be joined by Lynn Owens, who is the head of the NCA, for that particular meeting. Until then, I wish you all good health. Thank you.